Good morning, everyone. This is Debbie Rauscher with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Welcome to this morning's webinar. It's just about 1 minute before 10 o'clock, so I'm going to wait a couple minutes to let people continue to log on, and then we will go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who are just logging on, waiting for 1 minute I see a lot of people are still logging on, so we're going to give it just another couple minutes, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Debbie, and I am the Education Director with John Burton Advocates for Youth. Welcome to this morning's webinar about our education-related bills for 2020. If we can go on to the next slide. So I'm going to start with just some logistical information. Today's PowerPoint, if you want to download it and follow along, can be downloaded from the handout section on your control panel. You should see that there's actually 3 handouts there on your control panel. One is the PowerPoint slides as a PDF in case you want to be able to print them out or something. There's also our support letters for the 2 bills we're going to be talking about today, SB 860 and SB 958. At the end of the webinar, we're going to be talking about what you can do to help support these bills. One of the things we're going to be asking for is letters of support. So the templates for those letters are in the handout section, and so you can download that at any point during the webinar. We are also recording today's webinar, and a recording will be posted on the JBay website. Next slide. So quick overview of the agenda for today. We are going to be talking about 2 of the bills that JBay is sponsoring that are focused on educational outcomes for foster youth. So we're going to talk first about Senate Bill 860 and then about Senate Bill 958. We're also going to run through kind of what the legislative process looks like more generally, so you have the lay of the land for the months ahead, and then how you can help to make these bills into laws. We're actually going to be doing 2 Q&A sessions today. It's a little bit different than how we sometimes do things. After we finish the presentation on SB 860, we're going to take some questions about that bill before we move on to SB 958, and then we'll move on to 958 and take questions about that at the end. And if you think of an SB 860 question later on in the webinar, we can certainly cover additional questions at the end as well, but wanted to make some time in between the 2 bills to cover those questions. Next slide. So as I shared in the beginning, my name is Debbie Rauscher, and I'm with John Burton Advocates for Youth. I'm extremely excited that we have an amazing panel joining us today for the webinar. I am joined by Jordan Sosa with the California Youth Connection. He's the legislative coordinator there. Margaret Olmos from Foster Ed California with National Center for Youth Law. Akista Holani, who is a youth advocate with JBay. Christina Torres, also a youth advocate with CYC, California Youth Connection. And Esteban Ginsberg, who is with Senator Jim Bell's office. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here. Next slide. So before we jump into the bills themselves, I am going to just give a little bit of framing for why we as an organization, JBay, along with our co-sponsors on these bills, are focusing in on the issue of post-secondary education. And this is something, for those of you who are familiar with our organization, is something we've been working on for a number of years. And this chart that's in front of you now, I think really sort of captures in a picture how the economy has changed in recent years and why post-secondary education is even more essential than it's ever been in our history. So what this chart shows is the change in the number of jobs available based on how much the level of education that an individual has. And so it maps this out through the Great Recession that began in 2007 and then goes up to the last couple of years. And so you can see that during the Great Recession, what happened is our economy lost a huge number of jobs, 5.6 million jobs, and almost all of those jobs that were lost were jobs that were available to somebody with a high school diploma or less. And you can see the green line on the chart there shows you that. And then it essentially stays straight through the recovery, meaning that those 5.6 million jobs that were lost were never regained during the recovery. For somebody with an associate's degree or some college, there was a slight job loss, about 1.8 million jobs, but that has fully recovered. And in fact, there's been a net gain of jobs, 3.1 million jobs during the course of the recovery, so that we're a little bit ahead now in terms of jobs that are available to somebody with an associate's degree. And then the biggest gain was for individuals with a bachelor's degree or higher. You can see that there was virtually no job loss whatsoever of those jobs during the recession, and then huge uptick, 8.4 million jobs gained during the recovery. And so, even just in the last 10 or 12 years, there's been this enormous shift in our economy. Post-secondary education is just more essential than ever. I do want to also say that when we talk about post-secondary education, or when we use the term college in this webinar and in all of our other communications, we're not just referring to a four-year bachelor's degree path. There's all kinds of shorter degree and certificate programs available through the community colleges, career and technical education programs, that range from auto mechanics to graphic design to all kinds of healthcare fields. And so whatever educational path a particular young person wants to embark on, anything that's post-secondary, meaning additional training after high school, is really what we're talking about when we talk about post-secondary education. Next slide. So another question that comes up sometimes when we talk about post-secondary education is, well, do foster youth really even want to go to college? The answer to that is a resounding yes. There's actually been many different surveys done asking this question for different research reports, and the numbers are extremely consistent. Around 86% or so express a desire to go to college. We know that about 55% of foster youth ultimately end up enrolling in college. I will just say one thing about this number is there's different numbers you can find for this depending on the data. So this is based on the CalYouth study, which looked at how many foster youth were enrolled in some form of post-secondary education by the age of 19 or 20. There's other data that comes from DataQuest that looks specifically at whether students are enrolling in college directly out of high school. Those numbers are a little bit lower, but as we kind of get up to around 20 years old, we find that about 55% have enrolled in college. Unfortunately, what the data also shows is that only about 8% of foster youth ever complete either a 2 or a 4-year degree. So we're going from 86% wanting to go to college to 8% actually succeeding. And so that's really what we're trying to get at here with these two bills that we're going to be talking about today. Next slide. This is just a little bit more information sort of making the case that foster youth right now they're not aligned with their peers in terms of how they're doing once they do get to college. So you can see that this is numbers at community colleges looking at what percentage of students received a 2.0 GPA. This is a really essential boundary point because if you go below a 2.0 GPA, you're at risk of losing financial aid. And so 68% of foster youth achieve a 2.0 GPA at community colleges. So 68% of non-foster youth achieve a 2.0 GPA as compared to 54% of foster youth. So there's a pretty big gap there that we're still trying to figure out how we can close that gap. And these proposals today are really focused on closing that gap. So if we can go to the next slide. With that sort of framing, I'm going to transition over to our first bill, SB 860, and I'm going to turn it over to Margaret with Nickel, who's going to start us off.
Thank you, Debbie. Next slide. So I'm really here to talk about sort of the importance of FAFSA. So we know that this is one of the key drivers of post-secondary success for low-income students. The first step in starting the financial aid process for most students in the state is completing a free application for federal student aid, the FAFSA, which is used to access both state and federal financial aid, or the California DREAM Act application for non-citizens who do not qualify for federal aid. According to the National College Access Network, completion of the FAFSA is one of the best predictors of whether a high school senior will go to college, and high school seniors that complete the FAFSA are 84 times more likely to immediately enroll in post-secondary education. And more importantly, for very low income students, FAFSA completion is associated with a 127% increase in immediate college enrollment. Next slide. We also know that once a student is enrolled in college, the likelihood of success also increases with improved access to financial aid. A 2017 report on community college students in California found that 47% of students with zero expected family contributions to their college that received more than $7,500 in financial aid graduated or transferred, compared to just 17% who received between $1,001 and $2,500. A randomized control group in Wisconsin found that a $1,000 increase in grant improved college retention rates by up to 5 percentage points. Next slide. So we know that this is particularly important for the population that we all work with, and it is really acutely true for youth in care. So 85% of foster youth who are enrolled in some form of post-secondary education are at a community college level, and that's why we have really focused on that segment. A recent study examined the impact of Pell Grant receipts on youth in care enrolled in community colleges in California, and found that after controlling for all other variables, students who received a Pell Grant during their first year had a GPA that was on average 0.7% higher than those who did not receive the aid, and students with a Pell Grant completed 2.12 more units on average than those who did not receive a Pell Grant. Next slide. I think this is the most exciting slide that I have. Research from the Cal Youth Study examined outcomes for youth participating in California's extended foster care program who were enrolled in any form of post-secondary institutions. What they found looked at the impact of the Chafee Grant, a form of financial aid just for youth in care that requires completion of a FAFSA to access. The research found that youth receiving a Chafee Grant were 4.26 times more likely to persist than those who did not, after controlling for a variety of factors. Next slide. So it is clear from the data that financial aid can really make an enormous difference for youth in care, and yet we know that youth in care are not accessing aid at the rates that they should be. Data obtained from the community college system for the 2017-18 academic year found that only 49% of first-time students received a Pell Grant, the largest form of financial aid. In contrast, 78% of these same students received the Community College Promise Grant, which provides a fee waiver to low-income students. The income eligibility for these two sources is largely the same. The key difference between these two sources is that the fee waiver requires only the submission of the community college application, whereas the Pell Grant requires submission of the FAFSA. The Pell Grant provides up to $6,195 for students that importantly can be used both for tuition and non-tuition costs. Since the fee waiver covers tuition, this money can be used by students to pay for non-tuition costs, such as books, food, housing, and transportation, essential things to make the difference between persisting and not. Many foster youth struggle with paying for these types of costs, and having a grant like the Pell Grant can really make the difference. Based on this data, it is clear that the systems designed to support youth in care in this state are not doing an adequate job ensuring that FAFSAs are completed and these essential supports are in place before students arrive on a college campus. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that information. So if we can go to the next slide. So all of this data that Margaret just presented, both about how important financial aid is and about the fact that over half of foster youth, when they enter community college, are not receiving financial aid, really has led us at John Burton Advocates to Youth to really focus in on this issue. And what we found is that, as Margaret mentioned, you know, the big gap seems to be in completion of the FAFSA. And the FAFSA is complicated, and there are nuances that are specific to foster youth when they complete the FAFSA. And so we have been engaged in a number of different efforts to really make sure that foster youth are getting the support that they need to be able to complete the FAFSA. Now, what we found when we started looking at this a couple of years ago is that there are a lot of programs out there in communities to help foster youth with completing a FAFSA. So there's independent living programs, there's child welfare social workers, there's high school counselors, there's CASAs and ed rights holders, there's programs at the colleges specifically for foster youth. So there are folks out there with the expertise to be able to support foster youth with this, but there was no entity that was providing any sort of coordination, making sure, you know, it was very just kind of haphazard whether any particular foster youth managed to connect with somebody in their life to help them complete a FAFSA or not. And there was no way to know even, are foster youth getting FAFSAs done or not? It's like, well, let's just do some workshops and hope for the best. And so it was, you know, without somebody really coordinating and understanding who was getting a FAFSA done and who wasn't and where additional support was needed, we weren't really able to move the needle on changing these statistics. So if we go to the next slide. So that led us at John Burton Advocates for Youth to initiate something called the Foster Youth FAFSA Challenge. So we partnered with the California Department of Education and the California Community College Chancellor's Office back in November 2017 to do this Foster Youth FAFSA Challenge. It's now in its third year. And the basic idea was that we enlisted foster youth services coordinating programs, which we're going to be talking about in more detail shortly. But we enlisted these programs that exist in every county to serve as the central coordinators of efforts to get FAFSAs completed. I'm really excited to share that we have 52 of the 58 FYSCPs participating in the FAFSA Challenge, which is phenomenal. One of the real key pieces of this that was, I think, truly a game changer in this effort was getting the FYSCPs access to a system called Web Grants, which actually allows them to track whether students have or have not completed a financial aid application. And I'm going to talk more about Web Grants in a minute. And what the FYSCPs have been able to do is really serve in a coordinating role and bring together and coordinate all of the different partners that exist in the county to really kind of shine a light and focus attention on this issue of FAFSA completion. Next slide. I'm thrilled to say that this effort has been very successful. So the first year that we did it, FAFSA completion rates across the state was at 45%. This past year, 2018-19, that went up 57%. So really substantial increase. We're doing it again this year for 19-20. I feel quite optimistic that we're going to see even higher numbers for 19-20. And so what we learned from this was that focusing attention on this issue really makes a big difference. And having a mechanism for tracking completion and having a coordinating entity that can bring different partners together and really shine a spotlight on this and develop strategies that different partners can engage in order to get FAFSAs completed really has worked. We've been, really thrilled and so appreciative of the work that the FYSCPs have done over the last couple of years on this. Next slide. So I want to just say a word about web grants for those who might not be familiar with that system. It's a system that is operated by CSAC, California Student Aid Commission, and it allows LEAs, or local education agencies, to look up student-level data about FAFSA and DREAM Act completion. And so professionals in school districts and county offices of ed can go into the system and look by school and see which students have completed a financial aid application and which ones have not. In addition to this being a tool for tracking completion at a more aggregate level, there's a couple of other things that this has been really useful for identifying patterns in completion rates. So in particular, in some of the larger counties that have a lot of school districts, the FYSCPs were able to look and see, well, this school district is doing a really good job getting FAFSAs done, and this school district over here, not so much. And so rather than just send out blanket technical assistance materials to everybody, it allowed them to really target and hone in and really kind of know where to direct those resources based on what they were seeing in terms of where FAFSAs were being completed. It also enables student-specific intervention. So it's not just an aggregate data source, but a student-level data source. And so they can see, okay, these 4 students at Main Street High School haven't done a FAFSA. Let me reach out to the counselor over there and say, hey, you have 4 foster youth over there. Would you be able to do a FAFSA with them? So it certainly is a system that is not without challenges, and all of the FYSCPs who have been using the system for the last couple of years are well aware of some of the peculiarities of the system and the challenges, but nonetheless, it just has opened up sort of a whole new world in terms of the level of information that's been made available. Next slide. And so just sort of to kind of close sort of this background piece and about the FAFSA challenge, I just want to mention kind of some of the strategies that FYSCPs have engaged in over the last couple of years that have been really impactful. So Board of Supervisors resolution, this is something that was done in Los Angeles County. The Board of Supervisors issued a resolution instructing the child welfare and probation agencies to partner with the County Office of Education on FAFSA completion efforts. That's been a really impactful piece down in LA. College and career fairs, so Fresno, Riverside, there's been other counties as well that have hosted day-long events where foster youth come and they get to visit a campus and they fill out their FAFSA while they're there and engage in other matriculation activities. Data sharing with child welfare and probation has been a really powerful strategy. So again, the FYSCP will have the list of who's completed a FAFSA and who hasn't, and they can provide that information to the social worker, to the probation officer to say, hey, this student hasn't done a FAFSA yet. Next time you meet with them, because they are meeting with them monthly, can you check in with the caregiver, or can you follow up to see if the CASA can help them with this? Training to school counselors. This is another one where, again, Completing a FAFSA as a foster youth is not necessarily the same as a student who has never been in the foster care system, and so making sure that school counselors understand those nuances. San Bernardino is a great example where they've gone out and worked with the schools to reserve time in computer labs where the students can come in during school hours and work with the counselors to complete a FAFSA, with the FYSCP providing technical assistance specific to the needs of foster youth. Peer ambassadors is another really exciting strategy that was used in Kern County, where they actually have young people who are trained on how to complete the FAFSA, who go out and meet directly with other students to help support them in that effort. And these are just some of the strategies. There's many other creative and really extraordinary work that's being done around this. So I'm going to now turn it back over to Margaret, if we can go to the next slide. And she's going to take it from here.
Thanks, Debbie. So really, I mean, and we've seen this locally in our own work. The role of the FYSCP is to support the whole county, to support the to support all the districts within that county, and to really facilitate provision of educational support. We've seen them be the holders of data in really, really important ways. And this is why I think Nickel, along with JBay, believe that it makes the most sense to have this role be played by FYSCP, because it's such a unique role within all of the counties that we've worked. So next slide. And we've also seen in our work really the specialized needs of this population, and that FYSCP coordinators across the state are really the experts in their county on this population and those special needs. And we also know for the most part that it can be a very small population within the counties, and is so important given how specialized the needs are, how acute the needs are, and that so few people within the county truly have the expertise about what is sort of going to get this population over the finish line. And when we say finish line, to Debbie's earlier point, we are talking about persistence through post-secondary, whichever pathway that looks like, and it is going to look unique for each student. And again, the folks that know that best in the county are our FYSCP providers. Next slide. And Debbie, actually, do you mind taking this slide?
Sure, happy to. So what this is showing is the language that exists currently for FYSCPs in relation to post-secondary education. So we wanted to provide a little context kind of for what's in there now as compared to what SB 860 is going to propose to do. So FYSCPs have specific responsibilities related to supporting students' successful transition to college. The existing language and statute specifies that FYSCPs shall coordinate with post-secondary institutions to ensure foster youth pupils access programs that support their matriculation needs. That's essentially what they're already required to do. Among the programs designed to support successful matriculation, financial aid is really one of, if not the most crucial one of these programs. So, specifying FAFSA in this, which you'll see is what SB 860 is going to do when I get to the next slide, fits very easily into what the existing expectations are for the FYSCP programs. Next slide. So this takes us to SB 860. What is SB 860 actually proposing to do? In a nutshell, SB 860 would specify that the responsibilities of FYSCPs include coordination of efforts to ensure FAFSA completion among foster youth who are high school seniors. So I'm going to say a couple of things about sort of this piece of the legislation. One is that really kind of the motivation for us as JBay to pursue this is that, you know, we've seen such just spectacular results from the FAFSA challenge. We feel like, again, financial aid is really the game changer for whether a student success is, you know, once they get to college, if they're able to actually be successful there. And we know that the sort of the FAFSA challenge in its current form, with JBay sort of playing the role that we play, is not necessarily something that we're going to continue to do forever. And so we feel like it's really crucial that FAFSA remain a primary focus of the post-secondary matriculation work of the FYSCPs. So again, you know, statute already specifies post-secondary matriculation and support as part of the existing responsibilities for the FYSCPs. What this does is really clarify that FAFSA completion is a key component of that and is a required element in that post-secondary support that the programs are providing. The second thing that I want to point out about this, and I underline this word on the slide, is that what SB 860 requires is that FYSCPs coordinate efforts to ensure FAFSA completion. So some folks have asked the question, does this mean that FYSCPs are going to have to go out there and engage in direct service with students, because the law actually changed a few years back and really shifted the responsibilities of FYSCPs away from direct service to coordination and technical assistance. And so we are very cognizant of that, and so we are very, you know, we wanted to make sure that the language specified that the role of the FYSCP is coordination. As I talked about in the previous slide, there are lots of entities out there that can do FAFSAs: high school counselors, ILP, CASAs, resource parents, college programs. What was really missing was that central coordinating body and somebody to provide the technical assistance, because the high school counselors might know how to do a FAFSA, but they don't necessarily understand it for foster youth. And so that is the first part of SB 860. Next slide. The second part of SB 860 is also adding FAFSA completion rates to the reported data elements. So in statute currently, it specifies every other year, CDE, Department of Education, has to report certain data elements to the state. So things about high school graduation and suspension and expulsion rates, and there's various other indicators that are included there, transition to college. And so this would add to that list of indicators FAFSA completion rates. There's a few reasons why we feel like this is important. One is it allows the state to track over time and see whether progress is being made in this element, or if we're losing ground, or how things are going. It also ensures that the FYSCPs will continue to track this information locally by using the web grant system. And so again, as I talked about before, it enables them to then really target their interventions to see which school districts need more technical assistance, and et cetera. The other thing I'll just say about this is that currently in statute, there's two data elements related to post-secondary transition. So the first data element that's very clearly specified is that the programs report what percentage of students successfully matriculate into college, that enroll in college. The second one is a much vaguer language that says that CDE was required to work with the college systems to identify additional post-secondary indicators that should be collected and reported. And at the time that AB 854 was passed, which was what created the Foster Youth Services Coordinating Program, it wasn't really clear at that time sort of what would be the best indicator to really be able to look at this post-secondary piece. And so that language was put in to give some discretion to CDE about identifying additional indicators. Because of the work that's been done around the FAFSA challenge, and because so many of the FYSCPs were tracking FAFSA completion as part of that, CDE did ask the FYSCPs to report that data to them. So that's already been happening. And it really kind of falls under that piece that's already in statute that require CDE to identify some additional indicators. So that's the second piece. Now, one other thing I'll say about this is that, when we think about what does this data reporting look like, the reality is that, as Margaret shared, the number of foster youth in any given county is actually quite small. About 70% of counties have fewer than 50 foster youth who are high school seniors. And so for the vast majority of counties, it's a relatively small number of students that are being tracked. For those counties that are larger and have more significant numbers of high school seniors, one of the things that we were able to do with the Student Aid Commission this past year is actually work out an automated data matching system with them that has allowed, we've kind of piloted it with 10 of the largest counties, that actually allows them to get access to that data much more easily than through the web grant system itself. And I'm excited to share that CSAC has been working for the last couple of years on modernizing the web grant system. It is a very, very outdated system. And so by 2021, we expect there to be a whole new web grant system that's going to be a lot more user-friendly and a lot easier for folks to use, which should make this data tracking that much easier even than it's been thus far. So if we can go to the next slide, and if folks have questions about SB 860, please feel free to go ahead and send them in through the questions panel on your screen. As I mentioned, we're going to try to take a few of the questions before we move on to 958. But first, I want to turn it over to Kista Holani, who's a youth advocate with JBay, who's going to talk about some of her experiences and how this bill kind of relates to her. So Kista, if you could start maybe just by sharing a little bit of background about yourself and your experience in the foster care system.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. I'm glad to be on the call. I had troubles with school a lot towards the end. I didn't graduate traditionally out of high school. I ended up getting my diploma through adult school and then entering college at a later date. So it really wasn't like a traditional transition. And a lot of this stuff was new back when I was going through that. So I definitely had some trouble figuring out what I needed to do to sign up for college. And I'm thankful that I had a mentor of mine kind of give me a lot of that information. So.
Yeah, and so tell us a little bit about kind of your experience completing the FAFSA. I was sorry if it's loud in the background, but I was a dependent of Fresno County, and then I ended up living in Modesto. So I didn't actually remember this, but when I was a lot younger, apparently I had been to an event in Fresno that had signed me up for the FAFSA and all of that jazz. They kind of gave us a lot of, it was like a resource fair, basically. And I didn't remember that. But then when it came time for me to go into college and sign up for all of that, I had seen my information was already ready for FAFSA, which made that a lot easier on my transition. There were some other factors that I needed that were challenges, but for the most part, my mentor who works for County Office of Ed had helped me with a lot of the challenges. So it was good. Interesting. So it sounds like the fact that they had completed a FAFSA with you in Fresno, even though you didn't go to college immediately right after that, having that information in the system actually made it easier for you when you did get to the point where you were training.
It definitely did, because, it was obviously difficult being a dependent of a different county and getting some information moved over to just enroll in general. So it was really helpful to already have one leg up when it came to my FAFSA being completed. And I'm very thankful that Fresno did that resource fair.
Great. And do you think, I know you said you had a mentor who helped you. If you hadn't had that mentor, do you think it would have been a lot harder for you to make that transition into college?
Without a doubt. I thank God for her. It helped me so much. especially because it entered in a later date. And for those that haven't heard me speak before, I didn't age out of foster care. You know, I reunified with my biological mother a month before I turned 18, so it made things a little difficult to get help and resources and whatnot. You know, the access to help was just much different for me. So having that help from her was everything, and I think that's what's helped me push through college for sure.
Great. Well, thank you, Kista. And if you can, you know, stay on when we get to the Q&A. If people have specific questions for Kista about her experience, feel free to send those over. I will just share, somebody from Fresno just sent in, not a question, a comment about how they have this yearly event called Extreme Registration at Fresno City College. It's an amazing event that they've done for a long time. And she's really excited to hear, really excited to hear that the event helped you. So that's great feedback.
Yeah, I was in a group home, and I was much younger, and I had no idea what we were doing at the computers, and we were just getting a whole bunch of information and resources. But I was just happy to be outside of the group home. I really wasn't focused on what we were doing necessarily, but later on it did help the process move much faster. So yeah, I am thankful for Fresno having that opportunity for us.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much. If we can move on to the next slide. Before I get to the questions that are coming in, there's several questions that have sort of come up more than once in conversations I've had about this, so I thought I'd kind of walk through those first. So one of the questions that comes up is, does this shift the responsibilities of FYSCPs back to direct service? As I mentioned before, but I just want to reiterate, the bill language does specify the role of the FYSCP as one of coordination of FAFSA completion efforts, not direct service. Another question that has come up is, would this language require 100% FAFSA completion among foster youth? Because the language does say that FYSCPs will coordinate efforts to ensure foster youth complete the FAFSA. And the reason that we felt comfortable using the word ensure is not because we have an expectation that there's going to be 100% FAFSA completion. We know that, you know, that's, you know, we feel like if foster youth are completing the FAFSA at rates that are aligned with the general student population, which hovers around 60%, then, you know, we feel like that's pretty good. However, there is language in statute that sort of governs all of the responsibilities that the FYSCPs have, which says that those responsibilities should be completed to the extent possible. So there's kind of a caveat in there already about, you know, that there's a recognition that these are aspirational goals, and that there's going to be situations where it's not possible, and there's a recognition that there's an allowance for that. So I just want to clarify that there is no expectation being created here that there be 100% FAFSA completion. Another related question we've had is, what if a foster youth doesn't want to complete the FAFSA? Again, that's totally legitimate. If a foster youth is not interested in going to college, they don't want to complete the FAFSA, that's certainly their prerogative. This bill is not going to force anybody to complete a FAFSA or force anybody to go to college if that's really not the path that they want to be on. Again, you know, there's this to the extent possible language. The bill requires FAFSAs to be completed to the extent possible, and so there's always going to be those students across the state who choose not to do that, and that's fine. Next slide. A couple of other questions about sort of how this would be implemented. Will FYSCPs have flexibility regarding how they support FAFSA completion efforts? Answer to that question is absolutely yes. You know, I shared some of the strategies FYSCPs have used over the last couple of years. These are not all the strategies. You know, there's going to be local context. What makes sense in one community is going to be totally different from another. If you're in an urban area or a rural area, that's going to look different. And so that's why the language is very non-prescriptive. It doesn't specify an FYSCP must do the following 3 activities. You know, all it says is that they're coordinating efforts among their partners around FAFSA completion. Another question that was asked to me was, will FYSCPs be required to hold college and career events, such as the one that Keista talked about? No, again, depending on the county, sometimes that makes sense for a county, sometimes that's not feasible or just doesn't make sense in that context. There's no requirement that they hold an event or that they engage in any particular strategy. The FYSCP can choose whatever strategies make the most sense in their local context. Next slide. Another question that has come up is, well, isn't somebody already doing this? Aren't high school counselors doing this, or independent living programs doing this? And it's absolutely true that some students receive support from a high school counselor, some from ILP. With the ILP programs, we know that only about 50% of foster youth engage at all with ILP. And so when we look at the low rates of Pell Grant receipt, we see that less than half of community college foster youth are getting a Pell Grant. It's clear to us that while some may be getting support from a high school counselor or ILP, clearly they're not all. There's gaps that are happening there. There are many youth that are just falling through those cracks. High school counselors often have hundreds of students on their caseloads. And so without somebody there to say, hey, these three, you may have hundreds of students on your caseload, but these three are foster youth and they deserve some special attention from you, it's just likely that there's going to be a lot of the foster youth that do fall through the cracks. Another question that has come up a few times is there's a bill called AB 1617, and people have asked about how that intersects with this bill. So what AB 1617 would do would be to make FAFSA completion a high school graduation requirement. Now, I will just say that this would be a pretty significant change in California, and so whether this is going to move forward or not remains to be seen. We're in the very early days of the 2020 session, and so it's got a long way to go before that would actually become a law. But even if AB 1617 were to become a law, from our perspective, that actually makes it more imperative that the FYSCPs are doing this work, not less, because that would mean that FAFSA completion is a high school graduation requirement, and if a foster youth doesn't manage to do it, then they're at risk of not only not getting financial aid, but not completing high school. And again, completing a FAFSA for foster youth is different than for other students. And so we want to make sure that somebody like the FYSCP is out there providing the technical assistance so that those high school counselors don't just send the foster youth to some workshop with all the other students where they're being told a bunch of information that doesn't apply to them and they just get confused and aren't able to move forward. Next slide. So we can go on to the next slide. For some reason, I'm not seeing my slide change. Melissa, if you want to either send me a chat or maybe let me know, or you can just unmute yourself. I'm not sure if there's a problem with the slides changing.
Changing on my end. I don't know if anyone else can see it change on their end. I apologize.
It's changing on your end, but I'm not seeing it change on mine. Okay. Here's what I'm going to do. Yeah, somebody just wrote it. It's not changing on there. And yeah, once you try and... No, nothing's happening. Okay. I am going to quickly pull up the PowerPoint. My apologies. If folks can just give me a minute. I'm not sure why it's not moving. Okay, pulling up the PowerPoint, and I'm going to go ahead and take over the
issue, I think.
Screen sharing.
Let's see if it.
Okay, so Melissa, maybe. Okay, so go ahead and send me a chat if you kind of get it back together, and I might switch it back over to you, but in the meanwhile, I'll just take it over from here. So the next question is about tracking. People have asked, how are FYSCPs supposed to track the rates of FAFSA completion? As I've mentioned before, the The web grant system does allow FYSCPs to look up FAFSA status, and as I mentioned before, this should be even easier in 2021 when the new and improved web grant system comes on board. And we have been having conversations with CSAC about what they can do in order to make sure that that system works for these purposes. We have one question about the DREAM Act, because the bill does mention DREAM Act applications in addition to FAFSA, and there was a question about tracking that. So I wanted to clarify that the information available in web grants automatically captures both FAFSA and DREAM Act completion. So there's no additional tracking that's required. If a student does a DREAM Act application on their own or with somebody else, that automatically shows up in web grants, just like the FAFSA does. So that was included there, but it's sort of, they're synonymous basically in terms of how web grants looks at them. And then there's been some questions about who will ensure that there will be consistency in the data. So how does a county identify who their seniors are and which students are getting reported on? And so CDE would actually be responsible for developing data reporting rules. The way that this typically works is that in statute, it kind of sets the broad sort of parameters, and then at an implementation level, the entity like CDE would be the ones to sort of figure out the nitty-gritty of what that looks like. All right, I am now going to turn it over to Esteban. Esteban, you want to introduce yourself, say who you are, and launch in.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. My name is Esteban Ginsberg. I'm a legislative aide working for State Senator Jim Bell. I've been fortunate enough to work on some of the legislative efforts the past 2 years, and have been really grateful for all the support and engagement from the community. So really quickly, I just want to do a brief overview of who my boss is. So Senator Bell represents the 15th Senate District, which is most of Santa Clara County and all of San Jose. He has actually 4 decades of public service starting at the local level, the last 13 of which were here in the legislature. And throughout his career, he's been a big advocate for foster youth, passing AB 12 10 years ago, which extended foster care to age 21. And then in the past 3 years, working to expand access to higher education. So removing barriers to FAFSA completion with SB 12 in 2017. And then 2 years ago, working on expanding the Cal Grant, which was ultimately adopted in the budget with AB 1809, which also additionally provided $5 million in additional funding, specifically for foster youth to have a special Cal Grant. And then last year, we had SB 150, which helped remove barriers for the Chafee Award and make it more flexible to meet the needs of foster youth. So we can go to the next slide. So now I'm going to kind of give a high-level overview of the legislative process and what we can expect for the bill moving forward. Hopefully you guys are familiar with the Schoolhouse Rocks, I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill song, which does a pretty good job of going over it, and you can see that here in the calendar. So we've introduced the bill. It has a bill number, SB 860. The deadline to introduce additional bills is the end of this week, but we are good with our number. The first step that it will take is to be heard at a policy hearing, committee hearing. So this will be a committee of 7 senators who will take their first look at the bill. This will be referred to the Senate Education Committee, which we expect to have their hearings in late March. Hopefully, with their approval, it'll move on then to the fiscal hearing, and depending on the cost associated with the bill, which we don't anticipate there to be any, it'll move forward from there and then go to the Senate floor, where the whole body will have the opportunity to vote on the bill. If it receives the votes to move on, it will then go to the second house, which in this case is the Assembly, and repeat the process. So the committee hearing process, both policy and fiscal, and then to their floor. And then if the bill is amended at all in the other house, it has to come back just to ensure that members have the chance to vote on whatever new policy was added or taken out of the bill. After that final vote, it then goes to the governor's desk, where he can either sign the bill into law or veto it. If it is signed, it goes into effect January 1st of the next year, so January 1st, 2021. And throughout this process, a key for success for almost every bill is to have support, especially from stakeholders and those in the community. It's essential. So here's a few things that would be extremely helpful in supporting SB 860 and making sure it moves forward. The first of which is letters of support, and as Debbie mentioned, we have sample support letters available on the panel, the side panel for the webinar. So with these, the letters get sent into the committees where the bills are. So in this case, again, the Senate Education Committee, and it shows just the importance of the bill and the broad support for it. The other big thing would be to testify at the hearings themselves. So when this bill is presented in the committee, there's an opportunity for witnesses to speak to the merits of the bill, as well as those in the community to express their support. And when there's a long line of people lined up to show their support for the bill, that does make an impression on the members voting for them. And if possible, it's really important to hear from those directly impacted by the legislation. So recruiting students to testify is very powerful, and also a great way to get students more engaged with the whole legislative process and civics. And then lastly, and so J-Bay and Nickel plan to coordinate some outreach in regards to meeting with specific members in their districts. So just going to meet with the member, again, sharing personal testimony about the importance of the bill, and seeing if they can get their support. And excuse me, I'm going to take a sip of water. Sorry about that. There's also opportunities to visit the elected representatives in their capital offices to also appeal for the bill. And kick it back to Debbie.
Great. Thank you so much, Esteban. We're a little behind schedule. I want to make sure we have time for 9:58 as well, but I'm going to run through a couple of the questions that came in on 860 really quickly. One person asked to repeat the percent of students who attend post-secondary education when completing the FAFSA. So for low-income students in particular, it's 127% increase in likelihood of attending college if you complete a FAFSA. Another question is, do the counties have specific individuals assigned to FAFSA completion? The answer to that question is it depends. Different counties structure how they've been doing this work differently. We're actually going to be doing a whole nother webinar on March 4th all about best practices from the FAFSA challenge. So keep your eyes out for that. We're going to go into a lot more detail about what that's looked like in the counties. Next question is, will FYSCPs work with the colleges to be able to see who's completed the FAFSA? In other words, will web grants show and track which currently enrolled FROST youth attending college have completed a FAFSA? So the answer to that is no. That what you can see, what you can see on web grants is actually just the students who are in high school who've completed a FAFSA or not for students who are already in college. So that's why this is only focused on the high school students. Another question is, do community partners have access to web grants? Unfortunately not, because of the confidentiality restrictions. It's only available to school districts and county offices of education, which is why the FYSCP is such a crucial partner in this work. So I'm going to move on. There's a couple other questions that I'm going to save to the end because I want to move on to SB 958, the second one of our bills. So this is about a program, kind of switching gears now away from the high school students to students who are now enrolled in college and helping them to be successful in college. So this bill focuses on something called Next Up. What is Next Up? It is a program for foster youth attending community college. It's at 45 of the community colleges, provides a whole range of different kinds of academic and personal support, including direct financial support. It is also referred to as CAFES. That's the official name in statute, but sort of the branded name is Next Up, but they're referring to the same program. Why does this program exist? You know, there's just a lot of challenges that I think probably everybody on this call is aware of about, you know, for foster youth when they transition into college in terms of having experienced homelessness, attending poor quality high schools, higher rates of disability, and more likelihood of changing schools. So you can see some of that data on your screen there and some of the reasons why foster youth, when they do end up in community college, might have some additional challenges. And we see this, it's not just theoretical, we see this in the data. You know, I shared some GPA data earlier, but this is also college success, course success rates. You can see here on the chart, again, you know, some pretty big gaps between whether foster youth are succeeding in their courses versus non-foster youth. All of this led to the creation of the Next Up program. So it was created in 2014 and under Senate Bill 1023, and it was funded in 2015 for up to 10 districts with $15 million. The first programs became operational in fall of 2016. In 2018, thanks to the work of Senator Bell through SB 12, this was expanded to up to 20 districts. And so that's where we are now. The dollar amount went up as well to $20 million. And so this program is at 45 campuses serving about 1,800 students. That's actually, I'm realizing an old number, it's actually up more than 2,000 students now being served by the program. And so it's been a great program for students. And I don't just say that because I think it, but because there's actually data showing that that's true. So a couple of things that have come out recently. There was a study that looked at students receiving student support grants. So these are actual direct financial grants from programs like Next Up, and found that students that received these grants had a 0.2 higher GPA and completed on average 3 additional units beyond those who didn't receive the grants. Campus support program participation also increased persistence by 2.45 times. So students in these programs were almost 2.5 times more likely to persist than students who did not participate in a campus support program. We also recently did a survey of students. So we had over 200 students in the program respond. We had 224 students, I believe, respond to a survey. We asked them a couple of different questions about how effective the program was. You can see that 74% found it very effective. 86% rated it as either very helpful or helpful. Only like really less than 2% did not find the program helpful. We asked them about what services Next Up helped them with, and you can see kind of the top ranked things: enrolling in the correct classes, accessing priority registration, help them to get or keep financial aid to be able to stay enrolled in college. And 65% of students said that the Next Up program helped them to pass their classes. So it's pretty clearly a very effective program for helping foster youth. Some quotes from our survey. There's so many quotes, it was hard for me to choose, but I definitely would not have been able to succeed without this program. My counselor helping and encouraging me along the way for the past 3 years. I can say without them, I think I would have dropped out of college already. They are my biggest support and help. It's definitely made me feel like people care and gives me reassurance that I won't slip through the cracks. If it wasn't for the Next Up program and my counselors, I would not have made it this far. I wouldn't have the academic dreams that I have now. So these are straight from the students' mouths or computer keyboards. So why are we doing a bill about this? Well, there's some issues with eligibility that Jordan's going to talk about in a minute, but just to give you a little background on eligibility, what is the current eligibility for this program? You have to have been in foster care for at least one day at some point after the age of 16. You have to be enrolled in a minimum of 9 units. A student must be under age 26. They have to be a California resident, and they have to meet certain income requirements. So they have to qualify for the Promise Grant fee waiver with an expected family contribution of 0, which basically means they have to be very, very low income in order to have that EFC of 0 and qualify for the fee waiver. So I'm going to now turn it over to Jordan Sosa with California Youth Connection. Jordan?
Thanks, Debbie, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan Sosa, and I serve as the Legislative Coordinator for California Youth Connection, or CYC, and we're a youth-led organization comprised of current and former foster youth who are passionate about transforming the foster care system through legislative, policy, and practice change. And for the past year, I had the honor to be working with CYC's Legislative and Policy Fellows who set the organization's agenda to make sure that young people are equal partners to the policies and decisions that are made in our lives, and as of right now, talking about our educational careers. Right now, a lot of our work has been focused on the Foster Stability Campaign. Next slide, please. So 3 years ago, CYC's Legislative and Policy Committee developed the Foster Stability Campaign, which initially focused on addressing the lack of placement stability that a lot of young people were facing within the foster care system. However, CYC members have stated that stability is far more than just a placement. Stability requires to focus on all of our life domains. And in order to create a youth-centered system that honors and nourishes the mind, body, and soul of every youth impacted by California's foster care system, we need to address all aspects of our lives, which our members have identified as lifelong connections, health and wellness, having a place to call home, and educational stability. So this year, I had the privilege to work with Christina Torres, aka Chris, on continuing our Foster Stability Campaign and collaborating on this legislative proposal. If we could go to the next slide, and I would like to welcome Christina Torres.
Hello, good morning.
Hey, Chris. Would you like to share just a little bit on your background on just your CYC and what chapter you're from?
Yes, I have been a part of CYC since 2014. I had to take a leave of absence for a couple of years. I'm actually currently from Kern chapter.
Thanks, Chris. And so for the last November, we had a retreat to talk about what should be our legislative focus. And as we're working on the Foster Stability Campaign, I wanted to ask, what does education stability mean to you? Why is it important to you?
Education stability is important to me because without it, without being stable with your education, foster youth won't go like as far as they want, because for an example, my education stability was way out of proportion, and luckily I had people that were willing to help. But education stability is super, super important for foster youth.
Thanks, Chris. As you mentioned, when we're living in a setting where we might not have rights or have a voice, and decisions are made, and transitioning to complete independence, I wanted to ask, how did you hear about the Next Step program, and how do you got connected with it?
I heard about the Next Step program through the Bakersfield College. I actually, when I was going to BC, the reason why when I say I was is because I had to take a leave of absence from school too. That was due to an accident that I was in. But the Next Step program, while I was in it, it was so very helpful with just it helped with a variety, like they said, a variety of resources like bus passes. If you needed help with food, they would help you with food. Like for homelessness, if you need help with placement, can help you with that. If you need help with books, tutoring and stuff, the Next Step program was super, super, super helpful.
Thank you, Chris, for sharing your experience with Next Up programs. You said that you were helping with books, supplies. Was there any other experience you would like to share with the Next Up program? I've heard that you also have got services for even like bus passes.
Oh yes, the Next Up program provides bus passes if you need it to get to school or wherever you need to go. But they provided me with a couple of monthly bus passes or sometimes even day passes just to get to school when I needed to.
For sure. Thank you. And I want to ask, as a CYC legislative fellow, what motivated you to advocate for this particular proposal?
When I first started, as a legislative fellow, this was the main thing that caught my eye, the Next Up bill, because the reason why it caught my eye was because as a foster youth and as a former foster youth, I wish there was someone or some program just like this that was there for even the younger generations. And with this program, this will help the future generation of foster youth basically transform their lives into something better. And this will help future generations of foster youth basically graduate college.
Thanks, Chris. I think one thing you shared that's really important and that we've been advocating in our organization is to changing the narrative, taking the power back from the system to the youth, and showing that we're not just, not being part of the statistics. So I wanted to ask you, what would you like to achieve with your education?
With my education, like I said, I took a few years off because of an accident, but I'm actually planning on going back to school next fall. And I'm actually going into the law program.
Woohoo! Congratulations, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for sharing the insight and the importance to have access to resources within our community college. I think it's super important to make sure that we make this accessible for all youth who are, who have lived experience with the systems, to make sure that, we have the same opportunity to achieve educational stability. Oh, yes, Chris?
Oh, sorry. I just think that to have the foster youth go through this program, it'll help every foster youth that needs the help, whether they want it or not. It's something that I just wish this was something that for former foster youth was there. So as you said, the statistics and all this other stuff, I just want it all to go away. And with this program and with just different things, it will eventually.
Thanks, Chris. And that's why CYC is co-sponsoring with J-Bay Senate Bill 958. Is it possible to go to the next slide, please? So the provision of this bill will adjust the eligibility for Next Up programs and priority registrations to allow students who are in foster care after the age of 13 to participate. Currently, in order for students to qualify for Next Up and priority registration, a student must have been in foster care on or after their 16th birthday. Next Up staff have recognized that students with experience in foster care at age younger than 16 often present with challenges as great or greater than those in foster care later in life. There has been new data that supports these observations, A new study in 2018 found that foster youth who were reunified with their parents were less likely to graduate from high school and enroll in college than those who remained in foster care through their 18th birthday, who themselves lag far behind with our peers. And then a new 2019 study found that youth who had experienced foster care and were homeless were as likely to have exited foster care at a younger age as they were to have emancipated from care. This provision will also create more consistency. So with this provision, we want to create more consistency and make it easier for students to access these benefits. In 2017, as we mentioned, the legislature passed SB 12, which created an automated verification process for students to verify their foster care status for the purpose of the free application for federal student aid, or FAFSA. Financial aid offices can now automatically verify whether the student meets the FAFSA standard through the screening in their web grant. Because the federal government uses the standard of in foster care after age of 13, this same verification cannot currently be used to verify eligibility for Next Up or priority registration, because currently those standards are used at the age of 16 or older. If program eligibility is made consistent with financial aid qualifications, students will no longer have to bring paper verifications to qualify for Next Up or priority registration, removing any major barriers to participate. And our CYC members have shared this, that, as you heard from Christina Torres, that members appreciate and love to have access to these services. But with the age eligibility for 16 and older, a lot of youth have experienced a two-tier service within these programs. Depending on the qualification, there has been experiences members share that they have received services even if they were not in care after the age of 16, but it's very, very, very limited. We have members who, with siblings who had the same experience in foster care. However, they went to college together and they were unable to receive that service together because of the age difference, even though they grew up in the same home, had the same experience, and had the same goals and motivations to achieve higher education. Due to the age requirements, the members had different experiences to apply for this service. And there has, like we mentioned, there has been a lot of confusion and lack of support. If there has been a lot of confusion and lack of support from the youth to pursue higher education from their placement or from their home, and transitioning to independence, might be merging to adulthood or independence for the first time, it could be very confusing when there is different requirements for EOPS, for Next Up, for financial aid. So we want to make sure that we are making a streamlined process to make it easier and to not give any opportunity for the youth or the student to be dissuaded to apply for this opportunity. Next slide, please. So the second provision of the bill will allow programs to exercise professional judgment around income standards. Currently, in order for a youth to qualify, a student must meet the certain income threshold, which typically is either having the income below 150% of the poverty line or having an expected family contribution of 0 for financial aid. This is based on the student's income for 2 years from 2 years prior. Unlike with all other forms of financial aid, there is no allowance for exceptions based on professional judgment, such as significant loss of income or a student who may have less financial need but has significant need for services to be successful from Next Step programs. So students who have worked full-time prior to returning to school are sometimes disqualified based on the income despite having substantial current financial need. While the number who fall in this category is small, these kind of non-traditional students who are often in great need of support and cannot maintain their full employment while in college. This will give program staff flexibility to account for the types of changes in circumstances when evaluating eligibility. The amount of direct financial assistance available will continue to be based on the unmet need determined by financial aid office and students who meet the income criteria, while have priority for accessing the program if participation numbers must be limited. So there has been experiences from members, who, due to life circumstances and, and other responsibilities and obligations, can probably not pursue higher education at the moment and had to work full time, to work 2 to 3 jobs and then once going to pursue higher education, their income eligibility becomes a factor to not be able to qualify, which creates a barrier, though, at the time of need that they need this service. Next slide, please. And the third provision of this bill would allow programs to offer direct financial support prior to the first day of class. An interpretation of existing statute by the Chancellor's Office precludes Next Up programs from offering direct support to enrolled students prior to the first day of class. In order to persist in college, students need stable housing in place, books need to be purchased, and transportation to be secured prior to the start of class. Without the ability to assist students to purchase books and cover transportation costs before the first day of class, students may be less likely to be prepared at the beginning of the term and may even be unable to make it to school or the first day of class, putting the students at an even greater risk of academic failure. Many students also struggle to locate or maintain housing during the crucial transition during the summer prior to their first fall term. Programs need to have the ability to assist students with the stable housing prior to the start of class if they are able to focus on academics during the term. Next slide, please. And the fourth provision for this bill will require the program to implement rules for program applications and enrollment process are streamlined and do not impose barriers to entry. Some campuses have interpreted the existing law in a way that has led to implementations of barriers to enter this Next Up programs, and such as requiring students to submit multiple applications or placing limits on when students are eligible to enter the program. System for entry in the program need to be as straightforward and barrier-free as possible, given that a lot of the students who have experience with foster care have been traumatized by the system's design, supposedly designed to help us, and therefore we could most likely be discouraged by the bureaucratic barriers, the stipulations, and the criteria to forego accessing these services. Students students who have experience with foster care are also most likely than other students, including other low-income students, first generation, or academically disadvantaged students to experience a crisis that may jeopardize our ability to stay enrolled in college. This could be experiencing from homelessness or experiencing a mental health crisis. So it's very important for the students to have access to support as quickly and expeditiously as possible. We hope that the clarification of the law will support more streamlined access for potential programs, participants, and ensure that students get the help that they may need when they need it. And this is very, very important to make sure that, we make sure that this is accessible to youth who need it the most, to make sure that, like I said, when we're having to navigate these bureaucracies and these barriers, it could be this unfortunately could be an opportunity for us to be dissuaded to access this service. So it's really important to make sure that we make this accessible for our young people, to make sure that we could obtain our educational stability, since this is a pillar for our stability. And I will transition it back to Debbie.
Great. Thank you so much, Jordan. So we just have a couple of minutes left. So I think that the provisions that Jordan described are not particularly controversial. The issue with this bill is going to be that in order to expand eligibility to youth who are in care after 13, that's going to be 1,000 plus more students potentially who qualify for the program, and that is going to require a budget augmentation to the program. We estimate that it's going to take about $3.3 million in new annual funding in order to ensure that all students who qualify for the program can have access. So Esteban walked through the bill process. I want to just clarify one thing, is that there's a bill process for SB 958. There's also a separate budget process to get that $3 million. Those two things, while they're very closely related to each other, do happen separately. So Esteban already walked through the legislative calendar. I won't do that again, but between now and October, the bill itself, SB 958, will go through a bunch of different hearings. The budget calendar, however, is shorter. It only runs through June. And the governor submitted his budget proposal in January, and from now until May, there's going to be a whole bunch of budget hearings. And we need to have folks turn up at those budget hearings to express support for this if we want this to move forward. For this particular effort, it is really going to come down to the budget piece. A couple of things to think about in terms of the budget. There's things that work for us, some things that work against us. There is an expected budget surplus this year. That's always good news. On the other hand, there's going to be a lot of competing priorities, a lot of really valid priorities that legislators are going to be fighting for to be able to use that surplus for, and ours will be one of many ideas in the mix for how to use existing and additional funding. But it is, of course, helpful that there's an expected surplus. Prop 98, it sets a kind of a floor amount for how much money the state has to spend on K through 14, basically K through 12 plus community colleges. The way that it's implemented, though, it's on the plus side, it's a floor. So there's a certain percentage of the budget that has to go towards education. The downside is it also is kind of a cap. And so we're really sort of fighting for this budget money within the Prop 98 allocation and not from the rest of the general fund money. The other thing that kind of works against us a little bit is that there is an emphasis on local control. And so categorical programs such as Next Up sometimes are not viewed as favorably because they're really targeting a certain population instead of just letting a campus have money to target whichever population they would like to target. This requires them to target foster youth. So that's something we have to take into consideration. I also am going to mention something kind of related to this, which is that there is, in the governor's January budget, there was a $1 million reduction to the Casey's budget proposed to transition some of the administrative set-aside monies to a single pot that can be used for any program without any guarantee that that money would be used to support the Next Up program or foster youth in any way. So we are opposing that transition of the set-aside. So you may see requests for letters and such from us around that issue as well. It's slightly different than the SB 958 issue, but it is going to actually reduce the funding that's available to the program. So this is something that we want to make sure doesn't actually move forward. So Esteban talked about this also, but I will just reiterate. What can you do? Letters of support. You're going to be getting an email from me as soon as this webinar is over later today with the templates. And if you can take a few minutes to send in those letters, it really does make a difference. Truly, having those support letters is very impactful. Don't underestimate the value of sending in those letters. Testifying at hearings, we do have a bunch of budget hearings coming up. And so if you're in the Sacramento area or Bay Area or basically driving distance to Sacramento, we'd love to have you come testify at hearings, and you can let me know if you're willing to do that. Recruiting students to testify, of course, and then occasionally district visits. If there's a key committee member, we might actually go to their district, whether it's in LA or Butte or Fresno or wherever it is, to meet with them in the district with some local folks, and that could be something we ask you to join us on. There's a few hearings coming up that I just want to put on folks' radar for this bill. So next Tuesday, oops, I put Wednesday, that's wrong. Tuesday, February 25th is our first budget hearing, and we would love to have people come and speak during public comment on behalf of the budget request. So if that's something you might be willing to do, the final slide has my contact information on it. Please reach out to me. There's some additional hearings coming up, March 10th, April 23rd, May 15th. You can write these down, mark your calendar. Again, we really will need a lot of people to turn out for these hearings to move this budget request forward. $3.3 million is not an insignificant amount of money to be asking the state for. And so we have 2 minutes for Q&A. I apologize that we went over time. I didn't leave quite enough time for Q&A, but there's a couple questions that have come in, and if you have other questions, go ahead and send them in now. So one question is, this is from somebody who works at a Guardian Scholars program, which is a foster youth support program that's different from Next Up, that has not been able to get Next Up because it's only available to 20 districts. They're asking how their college can qualify for the grant. So it is capped at 20 districts right now, so there is no funding additionally available for more campuses. However, that is absolutely something that we're going to be continuing to look at for future years and expanding the program. The Community College Chancellor's Office actually has a report due at the end of March where they are going to be making recommendations about potential expansion of the program, and we're working closely with them on that. And so we certainly do hope to expand the program someday to more campuses. So we haven't forgotten that, unfortunately not this year, but someday. Another question is asking, what are the differences between the Next Up program and Guardian Scholars programs? Next Up is funded by this special state pot of money just for that. Guardian Scholars programs exist at many community colleges. Sometimes they go by different names, and they're funded in a variety of different ways. Sometimes the campus provides money. Some programs have to do external fundraising, and it's not a stable source of funding for those programs. And so Next Up programs are funded much, much more robustly. There's a lot more money available for campuses that operate Next Up programs than there are for campuses that don't have Next Up and are operating some other form of foster youth support program. So I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. So my contact information is there on the screen. You're welcome to reach out to me about any additional questions you have, or if you're interested in coming to hearings. As I said, you will be receiving a follow-up email from me with the support letter templates. If you haven't had a chance to download them yet from the control panel, you can still do that. And that ends today's webinar. Thank you all very much for participating, and thank you to our panelists.